Back in January, I battled an epic ice storm by publishing an Enduro bike comparison video, and you all loved it more than I loved the resulting dry snow. Well, as so many of you requested in the comments, let's break down how a bunch of great trail bikes all compare. The main comments I got in the Enduro bike video is, why isn't my favorite trail bike included? Well, that's because trail bikes don't make sense to compare to Enduro bikes. So hopefully I cover the bike you're most interested in here, and if you want to learn more about all these bikes, pop down into the description below where I have links to all of these bikes over to Jensen USA. Purchases through these links all help support my channel, and this is a big part of how I can make all these videos. Now, I'll do what no one else will do here. I'll define the categories a bit. Just like tensions in the Middle East, things here have certainly grown. An Enduro bike now uses a 170mm or longer fork. The fork is usually a Fox 38 or a RockShox Zeb. Rear travel for Enduro is usually 160 or more. Enduro bikes can climb, but the main design intent is usually to win pro-level EDR Enduro races, which are anywhere from 4 to 6 real downhill races in a row. Enduro bikes are often sufficient for bike park shredding all year long, as well as winch and plummet style riding. High speed, big hit, mega gnar, these bikes are full on. Now the bikes we actually ride on a daily basis are trail bikes. Let's say a trail bike uses a 150 to 160mm fork. Rear travel amount matters less than front travel, but these bikes are generally 140 to 160mm of rear travel. Today, trail bikes are the most common type of mountain bike you'll see on the trail. Sure, they can survive a day of bike park use here and there, but are happiest when pedaled on somewhat mountainous terrain with some tasty descending. These bikes are your true all-arounders, as they can handle big jumps just as well as 30-mile Vision Quest epics, and they won't be crazy overkill for your favorite blue trail on your local Chicken Licks Hill. There is another category just below this, light trail, which is the 120 to 130 zone. Bikes like the Ibis Ripmo, Norco Optic, Marin Rift Zone, Kona Process 134, and the Pivot Trail 429, which for the past decade were called trail bikes, are now light trail bikes. These use 34mm or pike forks. These are amazing for less mountainous environments, and in the hands of a good rider can still be very capable in the steeps. However, these rely more on geometry and less on suspension, so mistakes will not be as reliably erased. These bikes are happiest on epic rides and other glorious, cardio-powered jaunts through the woods. Now back to the trail bikes here. These bikes use a Fox 36 or a RockShox Lyric fork. In my opinion, both forks are great, and I don't really have a preference in this category. For wheels, aluminum is just fine, though I do tend to prefer a rim width around 30mm. The DT Swiss rear hubs can be easily upgraded to faster engagement, which is nice when using a 29-inch rear wheel. For parts, I need to mention that I am sponsored by Shimano, but I absolutely prefer Shimano brakes and drivetrains. The consistency from bike to bike is great, and the long-haul durability and precision are both fantastic. I prefer the mechanical drivetrains, and XT level is what I have on my personal bikes, but SLX through XTR are all great as well. For brakes, I'm happiest with the Shimano 4-piston units. In fact, I swapped a few of these bikes over from electronic drivetrains and dot fluid equipped brakes over to Shimano, as I feel I'm so much more comfortable with my preferred parts that I can have a better experience. Finally, tires. For the riding you see here, I immediately remove stock tires and go for something stronger and grippier. I tend to prefer Maxxis double down or DH casing tires and the Max Grip rubber almost year round. In the drier months, I do really enjoy WTB tough casing tires and often go to the larger 2.6 size WTB tires for true backcountry conditions. Sizing. I am just over 5 foot 8 inches tall or 174 centimeters. Most of these trail bikes fit perfectly in size medium, with 2 exceptions. With my dad bod or perhaps father figure, I am a full 175 pounds. I did race downhill and enduro in the pro class for about 10 years, and I've been riding mountain bikes since the mid-1990s, so my riding level is pretty advanced. To be fair, I'm pushing these bikes harder than 95% of customers, and that probably means I'm an awful reviewer. But don't worry about that minor detail, I'll just share the truth of what I feel when riding these rigs. And remember, if you're bike shopping, it's always best to ride a bike yourself before making that decision. In-frame storage. I'm not a huge fan, as I tend to forget what I have in there, and the real-life application of removing a door, digging out a bag, then finding what you need in the bag, it's enough of a chore that I'd rather just ignore whatever mechanical I'm having. Frame storage is a novel concept and deserved mentioning back in 2016 when Specialized really made it a thing. Since then, some brands like Ibis and Santa Cruz have done it well, while others do it poorly in a Me Too type of facade. Ibis's old pork chop bag is my favorite solution, with accessory bosses like what Pivot offers being my second favorite. I find it ironic that consumers will complain endlessly about no in-frame storage, then in the same breath, complain about increases in both cost and weight when bikes do finally have it. I'm a fan of keeping it simple, so kudos to Yeti and Pivot. finally here in summer and it's getting beautiful out, very hot and sunny. So I've actually started to wear shorts for this time of the year. I've been rocking shorts for my good supporters over at Endura, and these are the single track shorts. I really like them. They've got a nice easy to use vent on the side leg for extra ventilation, and there's 2 zippered pockets on the right side and 1 zippered pocket on the left. I forgot to unzip my vent over there. I've had really good success with these single track shorts. I definitely keep the waist tidily adjusted, and you can see my pelvic protection underneath. I'm rocking the Endura single track short sleeve jersey, which does a great job of keeping me cool, and it dries pretty quick. Not only that, but the material is quite durable. I've got links to both the Endura jerseys and cycling shorts over at Jensen USA down in the YouTube description below. Anything you purchase from those links at Jensen, whether it's a sweet Endura kit, some chain lube, a whole bike, whatever you need, that'll help support my channel, and it'll let our friends at Jensen and Endura know that you're big fans of my channel. All right, big thanks to all of you for watching and supporting and all that. Big thanks to Endura and Jensen. We're excited to go ride this bike. Let's go shred. The Stumpjumper EVO.
Asked for a little bit too much there.
The #1 bike you've all asked about in the Enduro video was the Stumpjumper EVO. Well, it's not an Enduro bike, it's a trail bike. Now that the new Stumpy 15 is launched, I'd love to include it, but alas, I haven't ridden one yet. Maybe one day. Anyhow, the old Stumpy EVO is still available brand new and at a fantastic price. Also, just like an opinion, many of you already have one, so it makes a good reference point. I bought my own Stumpy EVO in late 2022, and I'll mention that I did so at discounted industry pricing. The Stumpy EVO is a well-thought-out, well-engineered bike that can handle more action than a police officer in La Crosse, Wisconsin. Featuring a somewhat shorter reach, I went with the S3 size. I feel this is the correct size for me. While the reach measurement is short on paper, the slack geometry creates a bike that has a healthy wheelbase, and the bike was a lot of fun. I liked how easy and intuitive the Stumpy EVO is to jump. The horse link suspension is really easy to get airborne, and it's quite predictable when you're hitting bumps and landing from drops. The suspension performance is just fine with the stock link, and certainly better with the Cascade link, as the extra progression from the Cascade link is a nice benefit for us aggressive riders. The EVO's geometry adjustments are real, and after trying every single stock combo of chainstay and all 3 headset cups, I settled on a bit of an unusual combination. You see, I love to ride trails slightly differently than perhaps the original builders might have intended it to be ridden. I'm sprinting and pedaling in sections that most might just be cruising through, often in an attempt to jump some dumb object. As a result, I hit my pedals a lot. I'm also landing in weird spots. After bending many pedals and crank arms over the years, I've become a bit shy of low bottom bracket bikes. Some of the higher bikes still handle corners amazingly well, and modern suspension is so good I don't notice bikes pitching fore-aft very much. After reading a YouTube comment suggesting this, I kept my 29-inch rear wheel, but went to the mullet rear link. This raises the back of the bike and steepens the head tube angle. Then I used the slackest headset cup. I added a massive volume reducer to the rear shock, as the mullet link is a little detrimental to the suspension quality. But this setup really opened what I could do with the bike, and I quite liked the end result. It was slack enough to still corner well, and tall enough that I could comfortably charge through the rough. I still blame Specialized for starting the trend of excessively low bottom brackets, so the anarchist in me loves the irony that Specialized also makes a bike that can be configured to be one of the highest in this test. Logan and I spent a day going back and forth between the Stumpy EVO and the Ripmo AF, and he mentioned several times how well the Stumpy cornered with that setup. The Cascade link did have better suspension feel, but when I had to choose, I definitely prefer good geometry over good suspension. Some heavier folks have commented about torsional frame stiffness, and I found it was sufficient for my 175 pounds and my needs. For reference, I did find the Stumpy EVO torsionally stiffer than the Ibis Ripmo AF, though that was only really noticeable in the more extreme and jumpier situations. Overall, the Stumpy EVO 29-inch pedals just fine, but a DW Link bike like the Ripmo or the Switchblade, or even a VPP system, will be a little more energetic when you hop on the pedals. On the flip side, the horse can be more intuitive, predictable, and easier to jump than the DW. Both are great, and to me, I don't think either design would be a deal breaker. If you are finding a good deal on a Stumpy EVO and are willing to sacrifice a little bit of pedaling efficiency and pedal clearance for a well-thought-out, well-built bike, you've got my blessing. Go send it. There is a great reason why this bike is so popular. It's a good one. The Santa Cruz Bronson. Before I rave about this bike, full disclosure, I bought this Bronson myself, though at a bit of an industry discount. This bike really impressed me. Fun fact, there is only one thing I don't love about the Bronson, the fact that it's a mullet. I don't like how, when coming from a 29er, how slow the mullet rear wheel feels when pedaling, often across town, in the rain, totally bonked. I also don't love cornering with different size wheels, and I prefer manualing with a 29-inch rear wheel. But once we're past all that, man, the Bronson is an incredible bike. The suspension is excellent. I really like the feel of the big shock. It uses a full 230mm eye-to-eye. And that stock shock has a great tune that has an open feel on smaller stuff, but enough support for them bigger hits. The larger shock is both smoother and more controlled than the smaller options. I wish more bike brands would grab this low-hanging fruit, and I will mention, Ibis just did this with the launch of the new Ripmo V3. The general Bronson package is excellent. The cables install easily. It fits a full-size bottle. There is ample dropper clearance. It's quite a light frame. Torsional rigidity is spot on. And the ride feel, well, that is just pure fun. The Bronson is happiest when ridden on the standard blue and black level trails, and with a rider who wants to hit that bonus feature, who wants to manual from here to there, maybe around that corner. The leverage curve of the suspension is so nicely progressive, and the stock Super Deluxe shock is really well tuned and still allows for plenty of pop. This is one of the easiest bikes to get airborne in this group, which is fun to say because a few years ago, VPP bikes were often built to be more glued to the ground. The shorter reach of the Bronson allows for a super maneuverable bike, and I found my 160mm travel Lyric to work great on this chassis. The overall feel was surprisingly well balanced, and it really inspired me to try some silly, tiny, fun new lines. What I disliked with the small wheel inefficiencies nearly made up for with how easily the bike jumps and flicks. The VPP system pedals better than a Horselink, but it's also more forgiving on roots and rocks. The headset is an integrated type, and mine has been creaking. I need to play with adding some more thin spacers under the top cap, but my Hightower also does this, and I've seen other Santa Cruzes with the same creaky front end. It's not a big deal, and I don't mind it one bit, but just like that headache the next morning, it's easier to tolerate if you expect it before partaking. If fun is valued more highly than efficiency in covering big distances, the Bronson is a great bike. For me, it'd be the perfect second bike alongside something built up for those longer, more epic days. But on the weekday evening rides and jump sessions, the Bronson would be an easy choice. Oh, hey there, your video player's not broken, but if you scroll down a little bit and hit that subscribe button, it'll definitely start working again. Santa Cruz Hightower.
I can't hold my wheelie today.
Thank the Lord above, I finally got to borrow a Hightower. Huge props to Santa Cruz, who saw my Bronson video and offered a loaner Hightower to test out for a while. The Hightower is a very different feel from the Bronson, almost to the point that they are complementary bikes. The Hightower feels more built for distance and epic rides. It feels quicker on its feet and accelerates noticeably faster than does the Bronson. The Hightower feels extremely efficient and just wants to move forward. Between its excellent pedaling performance, its intuitive geometry, you can quickly feel that the Hightower was built to go places. The short top tube and relatively short back end make it easy to toss around and jump. But it won't be as playful as the little Bronson, and won't feel as natural and neutral on takeoffs and when nosing into steep landings. But it's also more well-rounded than the Bronson, and the esteemed Hightower still does great on new school jumpy trails, off weird drops, and when ridden like a total BMX hooligan. To me, the Hightower feels the most cross-country out of all these bikes, which is a good thing. I am still very impressed at how well it allows the rider to get loose on the descents. The geometry and the feel of the Hightower respond well to a variety of styles and techniques. Say you pedal out to the back 40 for a big, epic vision quest of a ride. The Hightower will respond well to your energetic inputs at the beginning of the ride. Then at the end, after you've discovered meaning and purpose, the same bike will still respond well to the less attentive and sloppy or exhausted rider. It's rare that so many different riding styles can all gel with a single bike, but this is absolutely the case with the Hightower. Folks often ask me about Ripmo versus Hightower, and I'm relieved to understand how vastly different they are. The Ripmo feels much bigger, much more capable of gobbling up the roots and the rocks on the descents, allowing a rider to pretend they're Lorik or Amari down each and every downhill. The Hightower feels smaller, a little more limited in the rough, and enjoys getting through the rough, but it understands you've still got 20 miles to go before you're back to the van. The The Hightower can be ridden well with several different styles, especially so with the I'm bonked and still have 15 miles to go with my tongue in the spoke style. It's an easy, intuitive, efficient bike, and I'm stoked to see how it fits basically between a Ripmo and a Ripley. It's more business-oriented than the Canyon Spectral, and more for distance than the Orbea Occam LT. Overall, the Hightower is a great bike, and I can't wait to get it set up with a bigger fork and a deeper drop seat post.
Fast, no jumping. Yes! First try. It's not even Friday.
The Ibis Ripmo V3. The tried and true Ripmo is the golden retriever of this list, lovable and perfect for nearly everyone. The latest update opened the bike up to many fun configurations, as it can be set up with either a 230 or 210 length rear shock. And this configures the rear travel to either 150 or 130. And all sizes and travel lengths are both dual 29 or mullet compatible. Of all these bikes listed here, this is perhaps my favorite all-arounder. This bike is a media loaner, and I've only got a few weeks of riding on it at this point, but I hope to keep riding it way too much in the upcoming months. I would be amiss to ignore the prior generation Ripmo, the fantastic V2. There were two versions of this, the V2 and the V2S, with the most noticeable difference being a UDH hanger on the S version. That prior V2 Gen Ripmo, produced from 2020 through 2024, is a fantastic bike. If you're bike shopping and find a great deal on an older Ripmo, and if the sizing works, it's a fantastic way to go. With the older rig, the ride feel was slightly more bomber than is the newer Ripmo, as the stock suspension components were a little bit beefier and the overall frame build is slightly more rigid. The older frame was a little bit lighter, and in my size medium, I found the old geometry to be already pretty close to what I'd say is perfect.
I guess I did pan.
There we go. Not real video, he's smiling while climbing. Ooh, he does that.
Moving into the newer era with the V3, the geometry did indeed change. The bike is now slightly slacker and has some new attention to detail that shows some nice evolution through the size range. This includes longer chainstays, a subtle steepening of seat angle, and a slight raise to the bottom bracket. Sizing is now different, as Ibis has added a fifth size to the new V3. Sizes small, medium, and extra medium are similar to the old small, medium, and large. But many folks are surprised that the new V3 has grown like that distant nephew of yours and is unrecognizably bigger in its new large and XL sizes. At 5 foot 8 inches, I'm still solidly a size medium.
Not too fast now. You hear?
If you're in that 5 foot 9 inch to 5 foot 11 inch range, consider going for the extra medium. Size large is now indeed pretty darn big, and starts to work for folks around 6 foot tall or so. On the trail, the new V3 Ripmo feels good. Ibis has increased the rear shock size and is using a Float X rather than the Enduro-oriented X2 from prior years. Up front, the bike now uses a 36 fork, and that combo of Float X and 36, along with the custom valving, gives the suspension a more trail bike feel than the older components did. This all keeps the Ripmo feeling more appropriate on the more common trails that folks often ride with a 160mm bike. I was actually looking for more damping and support, so I went a few tenths larger on the volume reducer in the stock Float X. I eventually swapped on a Fox Float DHX2 coil rear shock. I'll keep playing with various setups, and will eventually post a longer-term video that talks way too much about which shock to use when and where. For me, the new size medium still fits great. I'm able to jump it easily and intuitively. While it's slightly more to get off the ground than the Horselink bikes, it's still indeed very quick to fly. It also responds very nicely to pumping. But the magic really comes in when you're smashing through those square-edged hits. Ibis's implementation of the DW Link is very forgiving, allowing the rider to lose minimal speed through the rough. At the same time, when you go to pedal, there is ample traction on hand. This suspension system really does work well, and it's a nice balance between plushness, support, and efficiency. For the majority of riders, the rear suspension is tuned very well. Ibis installs a shock that comes with less compression, rebound damping than aftermarket options, so more aggressive or heavier riders may be well served to upgrade the rear shock down the road should they want the bike to feel more bomber.
All right, jump into this guy.
While all sizes of Ripmo are mullet compatible, the medium and small sizes now both come as de facto mullet bikes, so you will need to buy a 29-inch rear wheel and tire should you want dual 29-inch wheels. The Ripmo pedals better than the old Stumpjumper EVO and is more forgiving in the rough. It doesn't pedal quite as firmly as the Switchblade, nor is it as torsionally stiff as the Switchblade. At the same time, the Ripmo is nicely slacker and more plush. For flatter terrain, the Switchblade has the edge, and for more mountainous terrain, the Ripmo has some certain advantages. The Orbea Occam LT gives up a little bit of rigidity and is a tad less plush, but it enjoys hanging it out more on the ragged edge than does the Ripmo. While the Ripmo does have some nifty new features, it largely ignores gimmicks and keeps the focus where it should be, on delivering a reliable, solid bike that does exactly what we want it to. The Yeti SB140. I fell head over heels in love with the old SB130 lunch ride. Yeti loaned me that bike back in 2021. In fact, my co-parent liked it so much she ended up buying her own SB130, and a few years later, it's been a great complement to her own Ripmo. Back in 2022, when Yeti called and offered up a loaner of the SB140, I was super excited. The SB130 was just so good. That bike pedaled like a stray cat toward a can of forgotten tuna fish. All effort propels you right into the good stuff, allowing you to sink your teeth into that tasty descent, smell be damned. Yeti built the SB140 to be a little more purpose-built for the new school mountain bike trails, with a longer front end, longer rear end, steeper seat angle, and more progressive suspension. The SB140 pedals very well, and it's a confident descender. The frame is not as torsionally stiff as some of the other bikes here, but it's still got a good, predictable feel, and it's absolutely not sketchy. For those that like a bit more compliance, the Yeti probably has the most finely tuned chassis of the bunch. More stiffness would be good, but then it'd be an SB160. The SB140 really does enjoy higher speed trails, and I'd say it excels at faster trails than, say, a Switchblade, Stumpy EVO, or a Canyon Spectral. The geometry is quite balanced on the Yeti, and they have adjusted the chainstay length per the sizing. When I think back to riding in Colorado, this bike seems well built for the sort of terrain that encourages so many to visit the Rockies. The harder I pushed the SB140, the better it felt. I will admit that here in the Northwest, I found myself enjoying the SB160 a bit more, as I like not only the slacker head angle, but also the additional travel. The 140 is a great bike, it's just that the trails I tend to ride are a bit too slow, steep, and sketchy to really hit the 140 sweet spot. That said, the SB140 would be amazing back in California, or up in Cumberland, or riding around Downeyville. The SB140 is more capable in its sense than the Hightower, though the SB140 is a little more of a handful to manage on tighter climbs and in more backcountry scenarios. I wish I had more time on the SB140, as I have a theory that a shock swap would have me a lot happier. Yeti often specs a lot of compression damping on their stock shocks, whereas Ibis might use perhaps not enough. The Yeti feels more purpose-built for higher speed, flowier single track, whereas the Ibis is more well-rounded, and it would be my pick if I needed to do a bit of everything with just one bike. The old SB130 lunch ride was such a fun bike, but it was shorter in front and out back, responding more quickly to rider input, and it was easier for me to get it in the air. I did prefer the tune of the rear shock on the SB130 that I rode. The 140 is easier to ride in general, but the 130 more rewarded someone who really puts a lot of input into the chassis and doesn't mind some feedback. While the 130 was more fun at the beginning of a ride, the 140 is more predictable at the end. Pick your favorite ride feel and be a Richard about it. The Pivot Switchblade and the Yeti SB140 are clearly direct competitors. I preferred the slacker head angle of the Yeti, along with the shorter front end, both for my location and riding style. Unexpectedly to some, I like the slacker seat angle of the Switchblade when navigating technical climbs. I was able to get the Pivot set up to be quite comparable, but it does prioritize outright firm pedaling feel over the Yeti. The Pivot also has a stiffer carbon layup. The Pivot is a bigger is better, stiffer and stouter, slightly more, you could say, American bike, whereas the Yeti somehow feels more European. Then again, I often preferred the suspension of the Yeti. Yeti built a fantastic bike with the SB140, and I hope to get back onto one again in the near future.
Almost lost it.
The Pivot Switchblade. Now legal in all 50 states, Pivot gave the Switchblade a pretty big update in early 2024. Pivot opened the bike up quite a bit as a more competent all-arounder for the more modern, jumpy, high-speed trails. The Switchblade is sized quite large, and eventually I got pretty comfy on the size medium, though it always did feel a bit long up front. Once I swapped on a shorter stem and added a 1-degree slacker headset, the Switchblade started to perform much better for me in my region. With that larger sizing, the bike did great at higher speeds, and the chainstays are really nice when it comes to jumping. The torsional stiffness of the Switchblade is solid, and like I mentioned earlier, it's evident the bike is very well engineered. The pedaling performance of the Switchblade is very racy. The suspension is tuned such that the thing is a very firm platform when pedaling. Low-speed traction isn't bad, perhaps due to the short stays. I will say that at higher speed, the back end needs more attention and it can be a little more skittish since it is so short. And also, the shock is tuned for more support than outright traction and plushness. With the steeper head tube angle, slacker seat angle, and the short back end, the Switchblade is the easiest bike here to ride while seated. My own riding style is to stand up and be hyper, but it's worth noting that for those who are more old school, the Switchblade might be a really good choice. The firmer suspension keeps the rider higher in the travel, and combined with the shorter back end, it's also a little easier to avoid pedal strikes on the Switchblade. I appreciate that the pivot is very well designed with no pointless gimmicks. True to the name, the pivots and hardware are all quite solid, and I would expect the long-term ownership experience to be top-notch. The biggest challenge I have with the Switchblade was that long feeling front end, whereas the back end is definitely very short. Pivot designs their bikes down in Phoenix where the riding is incredibly different than up here in the Northwest. We have a lot more elevation on our regular trails, so we're often managing speed, whereas in the Southwest, the rider has to generate a lot of the speed themselves. If we do a 10-mile ride, we're going to be climbing at least 3,000 feet. I think there's a reason why the Pivot is so popular in California, Arizona, Colorado, and even in Utah. This would be a great bike up in Hurricane, crushing the Triple H down in Sedona, or rallying around South Mountain. The Switchblade is a whole different animal than the Stumpjumper EVO, as the Pivot is clearly more oriented to outright speed and pedaling. If you want playful, check out the Stumpjumper, but if you want speed and efficiency, the Switchblade is a better choice. The Switchblade is a bigger feel than the Santa Cruz Hightower, meaning it's more to manage on technical trails, and more encourages the rider to choose a straight line and monster truck their way through the chunder. I found that the Hightower is a bit plusher, and with that shorter overall wheelbase, my riding style gelled a little bit better with the Santa Cruz. I had an easier time maneuvering the Hightower on our local single tracks, and while it would find its upper ceiling more often, I didn't feel like I always had to go fast on the Santa Cruz to have a good time. Since both Pivot and Ibis base their suspension on the DW Link platform, it's fun to experience how different they feel on the trail. Ibis has prioritized traction and forgiveness, whereas Pivot has honed in more on support and efficiency. For my size medium bikes, the shorter wheelbase of the Ibis and slightly longer back end made for a bit more overall balance. I could ride the Ripmo either fast or slow and still have fun, whereas the Pivot preferred the higher speed stuff. I tend to really like bikes that amplify my own input, whereas the long front end of the Switchblade and slightly steeper head angle, it wasn't quite as receptive. It's still a fantastic bike, and I absolutely enjoyed my time on it. The Canyon Spectral. I had never ridden a direct-to-consumer bike until this Canyon came along. Canyon invited me to a media event they held here in town and mentioned I could take the bike home and test it for about another month. This was a super cool opportunity, so I jumped right on it. I had a blast riding the little Spectral. The Spectral is sized in an unusual manner. I almost always ride what brands call a size medium. The Canyon calls a hoe a spade, and I found myself suiting up to ride a size small. With a reach of 450 millimeters, the sizing is still pretty close, but I did notice my knee pads would shift the bike when turning right while climbing. Yeah, with the very upright cockpit, the bike was indeed a scooch short for me. I rebuilt the bike as I would any of my own personal bikes to a full Shimano XT group set. Between a longer stem, brakes I'm familiar with, and shifting I'm accustomed to, I got the bike feeling awesome. The shorter wheelbase and reach both meant the Spectral responded great to my very active riding style. The frame didn't feel quite as solid as the Switchblade, Ripmo, or Santa Cruz bikes, but not far off from the aluminum Stumpy EVO. I was a bit disappointed by the heavy use of gimmicks between the in-frame storage, the wildly pointless KIS system, and all the hyperbole on the website, but the bike is very real. I found the suspension to be well tuned for the bike's intended use, and I quite enjoyed riding it with clipless pedals, pushing it in and out of corners on a whim. When I was back on my usual flat pedals, I had a blast jibbing around with this bike. I fully understand why Braden Bringhurst enjoys this bike so much. It's a great rig, truly built for fun. To make for a quick comparison, the Spectral felt somewhat between the Santa Cruz Bronson and Hightower. Not quite as efficient as the Hightower, not quite as playful as a Bronson, but a lovely bike placed seemingly right between the two. For some folks, this will be a great bike. I can't comment on long-term durability, but it felt like a high-quality product.
Oh, this bike feels good.
The Orbea Occam LT. The Spanish brand Orbea has a very unique past, and the Occam had historically been a bit of an unusual bike. It used to blend pretty tame geometry with some fairly long-legged suspension. This would create a bike that was a real treat in the backcountry. But for 2024, Orbea redesigned the Occam and separated it into two distinct builds. There is the Occam SL, which is a lighter, longer-legged downcountry build. Then for the senders, we have the Occam LT. And that's what I'm riding here. The LT is in the same league as bikes like the Ripmo, Spectral, and SB140. In fact, the 2024 version of the Occam LT is almost identical to the former older sibling, the 2023 Enduro bike, the Ryon. Just Occam LT has slightly less travel, and that's a good thing. Orbea's geometry with the updated LT is absolutely spot on. I love manualing and wheeling this bike as the 440 chainstay gets through holes and roots very predictably. I got plenty inspired to try some silly trail hucks, and the bike feels confident enough that I always felt safe using janky stuff as a landing. Overall, the geometry and stiffness of the Occam is very nice. It's a great blend of stable, confident, yet still willing to wiggle its way through the tighter stuff. The suspension rides well and will do what you need it to do with no weird modifications required. My biggest complaint with the Occam is just loose bolts. The rear axle can loosen up with this design, so use the included Allen tool to tighten that axle before every ride. Also, the rocker link loosened up quite a lot on me, so keep an eye on that as well. On the descents, the Occam rides closest to the older Ibis Ripmo V2S. It's got all the fuel that the little devil on your shoulder needs to say, go for it, it'll be okay. But still enough of that all, don't worry, I gotcha, security from the angel on the other shoulder. It's not as efficient as a Switchblade, but it's also not going to beat you up as much on the longer rides. It'll also feel more balanced than the Switchblade on the descents. The Occam SL would be more comparable to the Hightower, and the Occam LT here would be more of an all-arounder than perhaps the Bronson. I preferred the Occam LT geometry over the Yeti SB140, but did prefer the feel of the Switch Infinity over the single pivot Orbea suspension.
Hello.
Conclusion. I can't say that one bike here is clearly better than the rest. There are so many factors that go into what makes a bike work for you, between pricing, ride feel, fit, and even availability. Where you're located will certainly have some bikes being more involved in the conversation, and riding style also plays a huge part. Jumpers tend to like shorter bikes, but folks who live in the steeps tend to like longer bikes. Some folks have rolling hills, others have massive mountains. I would recommend looking around a little bit, especially at a large online retailer like Jensen USA, as many of these bikes are currently available at some pretty steep discounts. Let me know down in the comments, which bike is your personal favorite and why? Did you click on this video because you're planning on an upcoming bike purchase? Or did you just look for something to distract you while you should have been finishing up your taxes? Big thanks to my friends over at Endura who sponsored this video. I've really enjoyed using Endura stuff the last few years, and those links down below to the Endura stuff take you over to Jensen USA. Jensen has also sponsored a ton of videos on my channel, and they're dealers for many of these bikes as well. I'll link to as many of the bikes as I can that are available at Jensen down in the description below. Also, big thanks to both Logan and Reilly who helped me a ton with filming this video. If you have a second to check them out on Instagram, I'd recommend it. And speaking of checking things out, check out that red subscribe button down below. If you can hit that, it'll really help us all out so we can keep making these videos. All right, everyone, thank you so much for checking this video out. I'll see you in the comments. Peace and wheelies.